faithfully delivering value and interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, we're interpreting the book Work, Consumerism, and the New Poor for you. Its author is Zygmunt Bauman, a renowned contemporary British sociologist and thinker. Every society has its poor, but how do they come about? How should society view them? How to eliminate poverty? Different societies have different explanations. The book we're covering today will show you how work ethics and consumerism shaped people's views on the poor across different historical periods. The book further points out that today, the poor are in the most dangerous situation ever. Bauman, the author, is hailed as the greatest sociologist writing in English today, having authored 57 books like Liquid Modernity and The Individualized Society. Truly prolific. Our Sally's Book Talk has previously introduced his representative work, Modernity and the Holocaust. And today's book, Work, Consumerism, and the New Poor, was first published in 1998. It's not long, only about 100,000 words, but every word carries immense weight. And at the British Journal of Sociology praised it as an important work by an outstanding scholar, introducing a whole new dimension to thinking about poverty. The dimension Bauman introduced is modernity, meaning linking modernity's core traits with the poor's specific situations for deeper reflection. Less he was to adopter has committed a set of hopes. Bauman argues that we've moved from the 19th century producer society to a consumer society. In this shift, the identity and value of the poor have been gradually degraded. In the past, society's attitude toward the poor was mixed. Fear and aversion on one hand, pity and sympathy on the other. But today, the poor are seen as a total nuisance. People no longer feel pity or sympathy for the poor, just fear and resentment, even wanting to eliminate them. Brrr. In the book, Bauman meticulously details how attitudes toward the poor changed from the producer to consumer society and reflects on the social consequences. Next, I'll break down the book's main content into 3 parts for you. First, what is a producer society? How did this society treat the poor? Second, how we transitioned to a consumer society and gave rise to the new poor. Third, what kind of situation did the new poor face in the consumer society? All right, let's dive into part 1 and understand what a producer society is and how it treated the poor. The producer society is a socio-economic concept referring to the first stage of modern society, the industrialization phase, starting from the 1760s. After the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, it spread across Europe and North America. By the early 19th century, capitalist production in the Western world had shifted from handicraft workshops to large-scale industry, entering the industrial age. The producer society held this belief. The whole society was like one giant factory. The idea that every able-bodied person should join industrial production clashed with earlier views on labor. In traditional pre-industrial societies, people did productive work, like farming, trade, or crafts, but in a self-sufficient way, setting their own goals, controlling the process, and finding meaning and motivation. Since it was self-sufficient and a person only needed so much. So once people met their needs and hit their targets, they stopped chasing more. After all, there were so many fun things to do. Why work day and night, slaving away? That's why, when the industrial era dawned, most folks didn't want to be factory workers and rejected the pace set by bosses, clocks, and machines. But this traditional work habit was seen by industrialization advocates as a bad habit, a resistance that had to be overcome. In their eyes, with large-scale industry growing, humans would conquer nature and build a beautiful, magical, abundant world. But if people weren't willing to do industrial work and give their all, that great new world couldn't be built. To fix the labor shortage for industrialization, they had to pull as many people as possible into the factory system. The top planners of industrial society started pushing a work ethic across society. The core of this work ethic is that work is justice.
To live is to work. Not working is a sin.
In other words, the work ethic was a man-made concept by industrial society to max out productivity, and it has two layers. First, it enabled laborers to passively complete tasks set and controlled by others. To achieve this, capitalists mechanically trained workers to habitually obey without thinking, turning themselves into soulless cogs in a complex machine. Second, it separated what people did from what they considered meaningful, making them prioritize what they could do over what they needed to do. Ultimately, the goal was to make people stop caring about dignity, honor, feelings, or purpose. Just work hard day after day, against the clock, even without seeing meaning in their efforts. So, how was this work ethic promoted and popularized? Religious organizations played a crucial role, with churches creating work-related moral stories that emphasized work as a duty to God and nature. Countries like the UK and US actively established Sunday schools, free schools operating only on Sundays for factory working teams, providing religious and literacy education. Emerging in the late 18th century and peaking in the early 19th, Sunday schools instilled work ethic, aligned rules and values in youth as much as possible. These religious and moral disciplines proved highly effective. Sociologist Max Weber, in his seminal work, The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, noted that Puritans in industrial society viewed work as moral cultivation and fulfillment of divine commandments. They believed work was moral virtue, while idleness meant moral decay. Additionally, this work ethic leveraged patriarchal social structures. Bauman observed that work ethic preachers were often traditional patriarchal family advocates. No coincidence, but a deliberate strategy. Since most producers were men, industrial promoters offered incentives for their compliance while working hard. What incentives? Promoting and propagating these men as household heads. Though disciplined by foremen in factories, these men held absolute domestic authority as breadwinners. Hearing this, you might ask, weren't men already household heads in traditional society? Of course they were. But before the Industrial Revolution, society's basic economic unit was the extended family, not the nuclear family. Apart from the family patriarch, all men were just members of the clan. And after the Industrial Revolution, monogamous households replaced traditional clan structures, and adult men became household authorities. Reinforcing this made the workforce more compliant with work ethics, centering identity around work to drive productivity. Additionally, producer society architects gained social stability through family structures. So how did this producer society treat the poor? As mentioned earlier, the vision was for all able-bodied people, especially men, to join industrial production.
Thus, the poor were equated with the unemployed, insinuating poverty resulted from laziness.
This society addressed poverty by luring the poor into factories and forcing compliance when necessary. Workers earned little but fared better than the unemployed, so weren't classified as poor. Hence, in the 1820s to 1830s, Western societies implemented minimal aid through workhouses offering subsistence-level support. For example, if minimum wage was $1,000 monthly, workhouse residents got at most $800. This differentiated genuine poor from work-shy imposters, pushing anyone employable toward factories. Workers received psychological comfort alongside this grim choice. Mainstream values taught them that wage-earning misery carried moral superiority. Of course, factory work didn't mean prosperity. For poor laborers, capitalists enforced subsistence wages, keeping pay barely livable. Workers could only survive till dawn with that pay. They had no choice but to keep grinding. This cruel principle had a lofty justification. People then believed the poor were content staying put and wouldn't work harder for more, so subsistence wages sufficed. Pay them well and they'd just idle around and stir up trouble. Enlightenment thinker John Locke claimed the poor were born undisciplined and lazy. To fix this, he suggested locking the poor in workshops for strict discipline, forcing labor with meager pay and beatings, while sending their kids to poor schools for job training. And if Locke's ideas seem too severe, consider Bentham's view. Bentham was a British jurist and leading utilitarian philosopher. He never cared about human emotions or motives. He argued moral or economic incentives failed. Only raw coercion worked against fickle, foolish poor people. Bentham proposed 500 houses, each holding 2,000 burdensome poor under constant surveillance by overseers. Non-workers got nothing but moldy bread and tasteless water, with complete social isolation. This incentive would perfectly drive maximum effort. Those familiar with Bentham would recognize this as a factory version of his panopticon prison. He believed only this could transform the poor from waste into assets. Bauman commented that Bentham's methods seemed cold, but they directly pursued work ethic's ultimate goal: unconditional obedience to factory discipline. Through top-down surveillance, it assimilated their dull but orderly behavior. All right, let's recap part one. The producer society was modern society's first stage, industrialization. Here, work ethics were created to maximize productivity, making people feel not working was sinful. In a producer society, the poor were basically equated with the unemployed. Many were forced into factories by economic, moral, or coercive pressures, even though their wages barely covered basic survival. All right, now let's move to part two, understanding the consumer society. Starting from the 1960s and 70s, Western countries entered modernity's second phase, shifting from producer to consumer society, with large-scale industrial employment rapidly shrinking. Small-scale freelance groups replaced mass production, flexible labor replaced lifetime employment, and temporary contracts replaced permanent hires. Why this transformation? Simply put, technological advances and globalization boosted productivity, so capitalists needed fewer workers. But people still had value. Where exactly? Not for production, but for consumption. Today's advanced economies rarely face insufficient production. Instead, overcapacity gives them headaches. Without stimulating consumption, production can't continue. Then, economic growth stalls. Thus, any economic issue, output drops, order shortages, empty malls, gets blamed on weak consumer confidence, as if endless buying sprees could fix everything. But why would anyone constantly consume? Sure, consumption satisfies desires, but that satisfaction is fleeting. Long before consumerism, psychologist Freud noted that fulfilling a nagging need brings brief happiness, followed by boredom. Once the desire's reason vanishes, its object loses appeal. To counter this human tendency, consumer markets constantly stoke new desires. They ignite fresh wants before old ones are even satisfied. They offer new prey before ownership breeds boredom or frustration. Recall from part one, producer society invented work ethics to maximize productivity. So, consumer society created a new concept to maximize consumption desire: consumption aesthetics. Ethics emphasizes morality and duty, while aesthetics focuses on sensation and experience. Consumption aesthetics portrays the world as a matrix of intense feelings and profound experiences, all goods designed for maximum impact and instant obsolescence. Maximum impact is meant to ignite consumers' buying urges. Instant obsolescence pushes consumers to quickly buy something else. Ideally, consumption should bring instant gratification without skills or preparation. Once consumed, that satisfaction should vanish as quickly as possible. Every product whispers, "Think this is all? The best is yet to come." People become consumers in this world, feeling in control, able to judge or reject products. Yet they can't reject choice itself. They must daily seek identity and status through consumption. Bauman notes today's global trend. Shortening product lifespans and unstable jobs create short-cycle, uncertain production. Earlier we said, in producer society, work was identity's anchor. Stable careers were viable. In consumer society, building lifelong identity around work is a dead end for most. Today's buzzword is flexibility. a hire and fire game with no rules, causing seismic shifts. Yet consumerism accustomed people embrace flexibility, applying consumption logic to life, maximize choices. People believe they should stay flexible, adapt to change, and ideally hold multiple identities as envy-worthy/professionals. Bauman further points out that in consumer society, there's a distinction between normal life and happy life. Normal life means being able to make choices from various public opportunities to gain pleasant feelings and vivid experiences. While happy life means being able to seize many opportunities, and especially to grab the most talked about and envied ones first. In other words, the freedom of choice determines the class hierarchy in consumer society. The greater the freedom of choice one has, the more choices one exercises, the higher their social status, and the more respect and self-esteem they gain. Consumption aesthetics has not only replaced work ethics as the mainstream value of modern society, but also made people judge work's value using aesthetic standards. Certain professions are given refined aesthetic meanings. People see these jobs as fulfilling or rewarding, making practitioners proud and honored. For example, scientists, entrepreneurs, artists, while other mundane jobs that don't provide intrinsic satisfaction are seen as having no value or meaning. For example, security guards, delivery persons, cashiers. The former are interesting, the latter are boring. However, people don't willingly choose boring jobs because this job stratification mirrors social stratification itself. Jobs deemed meaningful and valuable are privileges for a minority, exclusive markers of the elite, while others can only admire them from afar with awe and envy. Having said that, we can discuss the poor in consumer society, who exhibit three characteristics. The first characteristic is easiest to grasp. They are non-consumers. They cannot fulfill the most vital social responsibility, actively and effectively buying goods and services offered by the market. Oh. The second characteristic is that they cannot choose, and because of this, they're excluded from normal life and even further from happy life. The third characteristic is that even if employed, they're stuck in boring work and thus feel shame and guilt. In short, consumer society's poor are defined as flawed, defective, imperfect, inherently deficient consumers, abandoned, deprived, degraded, and excluded from the social feast shared by normal people. Hearing this, you might ask me, my salary is low and I love shopping, so I'm a moonlight plan. Does that count as poor? No. According to Bauman's definition, you're not the new poor. In fact, you're the type of member consumer society loves most because you spend almost all your money on shopping. Others might say, what about me? My income is unstable. I change jobs often. Does that make me poor? Also, no. In today's society, it doesn't care how much you earn. It only cares how you spend what you earn. So the basic standard for measuring if someone is the new poor is whether they consume actively, proactively, and continuously. All right, let's summarize part 2. Starting from the 1970s, Western countries gradually shifted from producer to consumer society. Consumption replaced work, linking personal motivation, social integration, and system reproduction. Consumption aesthetics replaced work ethics as the mainstream social value. In consumer society, the poor are no longer the unemployed. They are non-consumers who cannot seize opportunities, make choices, or fulfill the most important social responsibility. Oh, David, they are excluded from normal life and happy life. Next, in part 3, we'll explore what dangers the poor in consumer society face. Bauman points out that traditional societies treated the poor better than modern societies do. Take Europe as an example. Before modernization, in the Christian world, the poor, like everyone else, were children of God, an indispensable part of the sacred chain of being. Moreover, Christianity praised the benefits and virtues of poverty, saying the sufferings of the poor would be compensated by God, while the rich might find it harder to enter heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, giving the poor a lasting spiritual superiority over the rich. The poor then, indeed, lived hard lives, but they saw their suffering as a guarantee of entering heaven and gaining redemption, and the rich had to help and aid the poor, thereby gaining their own redemption. In the producer society, the poor were defined as the reserve army of labor. Unemployment and poverty became synonymous. However, despite this, the poor were still useful. The rich drove them into factories, using moral, economic, or coercive means to force them to work, all to exploit and extract their labor. As long as the poor have a job, they can maintain a sense of dignity. In consumer society, the poor become non-consumers. Today's economy no longer needs a large workforce. Whether the poor participate in production or not doesn't affect productivity growth or capitalist profits. This word, in capitalists' eyes, producers are temporary, replaceable, disposable. What matters are consumers. If a person doesn't consume, they lose their value. Thus, for the first time in history, the poor have become completely useless people. The poor in consumer society are redundant, non-essential, unwanted. They can't increase social wealth. They only add to society's burdens. So how would they be treated? Bauman notes that an essential attribute of modernization is adherence to order and norms. Order and norms seem positive and constructive, spurring people to improve reality and achieve progress. But for non-conforming, useless, or harmful elements, they should be split, cut off, excised, expelled, like a gardener eliminating weeds without hesitation. Since consumer society labels the poor as useless, they'll face exclusion and elimination.
Hearing this, you might say, wait, we're civilized today. How could we expel someone just for being poor?
Where's people's moral sense? A valid point. Bauman considered this too. He admits most people want to be moral, and morality's essence is the impulsive responsibility to seek well-being for the weak, unfortunate, and suffering. Though the poor have lost economic significance, helping them still holds moral meaning. But this significance is constantly weakening. In 1963, the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal first used underclass to describe the poor. Myrdal used this term with good intentions. He feared deindustrialization would permanently trap growing populations in unemployment. These underclass members didn't choose to exit, their victims expelled by economic logic. Yet underclass soon acquired negative connotations. In 1977, a Time magazine cover story described the underclass as troublesome social misfits, claiming helping them was meaningless and futile. By 1992, American political scientist Lawrence Mead could openly state that society had provided the poor with many opportunities. But the poor refused to accept them. Therefore, social policies must fairly and firmly resist the passive poor until reason is reawakened, until they themselves collapse. Bauman points out that rhetoric blaming the poor for their plight gradually absolved society of guilt and responsibility. People felt no duty toward the poor's hardships nor guilt for abandoning moral obligations, and this was just the beginning, as poverty became linked to crime. Media eagerly collaborated with police, constantly reporting the poor's alleged moral decay and criminal tendencies, showcasing ugly images of crime and slums, drug dealing, promiscuity, and brawls. In 1995, American sociologist Herbert Gans defined the underclass as including dropouts, vagrants, the homeless, unwed mothers, welfare-dependent single mothers, plus beggars, alcoholics, addicts, street criminals, even public housing residents, illegal immigrants, and teen gang members.
Clearly, this was a terrifying group, provoking public fear and anxiety.
Thus, in the public consciousness, the poor became not just useless, but harmful, as Bauman writes. Between relief-dependent people and drug dealers, robbers, murderers, there's only a thin, easily crossed line. Helping the poor is no longer a moral duty. Vigilance against and elimination of their threat has instead become a moral responsibility. The next step was isolation. sealing them off to protect the majority's normal rights and lives, requiring containment vessels. Modern penal systems and urban planning provided such containers. Prisons, slums, refugee camps. Western nations built more prisons, expanded imprisonable offenses, and imposed longer, harsher sentences. This was most evident in the United States. Bauman notes that since the 1980s, America built ever more prisons, while death penalty rulings grew increasingly arbitrary and capricious. Whether Republican or Democratic candidates, they all advocate using strong police forces to crack down on those who depend on society yet violate its values. Originally, prisons were meant to turn criminals into law-abiding citizens. But today in Western countries, prisons have almost become reservations and segregated zones specifically targeting the poor. For prisoners on parole or probation, reintegrating into society is impossible. They can only return to prison. Will this cycle ever stop? Bauman argues that, logically, once the chain of expulsion begins, it continues link by link. So where is the final destination for the poor?
Bauman says the simplest answer is to disappear without a trace.
They first vanish from bustling consumer markets, then from people's moral obligations, after that from public view and social life, until complete disappearance. Today's poor are powerless to resist this fate of expulsion. They are not the working class of the producer society. In the previous era, though exploited by the bourgeoisie, the working class had pride as laborers and believed themselves pioneers of a more advanced socio-political order. They hated capitalists with unearned wealth, and this hatred could transform into revolutionary force. But today's poor lack this dignity. In their self-perception, the pain of being unable to consume is tightly bound to the shame of rejection. They don't resist consumption's allure. They desperately want to join in, and they don't hate the rich. On the contrary, they long to be rich. Toward their poverty, they feel less anger and more inferiority. This overwhelming shame prevents them from turning their lack of money into a public issue. More importantly, even if today's poor wanted to rebel, they couldn't form parties with class consciousness and practice like proletarian alliances. In producer society, factory work was stable, so workers easily formed alliances, sharing both prosperity and hardship. In consumer society, individuals or colleagues might be at different companies daily. Today's partners may go separate ways tomorrow. So, enduring relationships, firm commitments, and unbreakable friendships become unattainable, precisely what mutual support in hardship requires. Therefore, the suffering of the poor can hardly converge into a common cause, nor can they unite and struggle anymore. In other words, the new poor are unable to resist their fate of expulsion.
Meanwhile, there's a strong impulse to completely erase these stains from the landscape, wiping away every blemish on the canvas of an orderly world and normal society.
Bauman says we all know what might happen next. He warns us that if discrimination against the poor continues unchecked, an irreversible catastrophe will eventually arrive. It's a one-way ticket to the scrap heap. All right, having said this, we've now covered the main content of work, consumerism, and the new poor. You might find Bauman's analysis of producer and consumer societies convincing, but think his predictions about the poor's ultimate fate are alarmist. This actually relates to the thinker's own characteristics. Bauman, a Polish-born Jew, focused his life's work on Nazi atrocities during World War II, which formed the core of his academic thinking. In his masterpiece, Scholarly Paradigm Shifting, Bauman argued the Holocaust wasn't a deviation from human progress, nor a cancer in civilized society, just modernity's other face. The Nazis' expulsion and massacre of Jews revealed the horrors when moral considerations are suppressed. What efficiency can a modern society achieve when determined to eliminate a group? It was with these reflections that Bauman wrote Work, Consumerism, and the New Poor, penning his pessimistic prophecy for the poor's fate. From this perspective, the poor are a lens. Through this lens, Bauman conducted his lifelong critique of modernity.
But Bauman also urges us not to lose hope. He said history witnessed many atrocities, and when they were budding, many dismissed warnings or omens. Yet many ominous prophecies in human history ultimately didn't come true. Now that the omen has appeared, we cannot wait until disaster strikes to reflect in sorrow. We stand here, we've seen the omen, and we still hold the power of choice. All right, that's the end of our interpretation of work, consumerism, and the new poor for you. You can find the reading notes below the audio. See you next time.